Michael Hayes stepped off the bus, his boots sinking into the mud of a town that felt like it had been waiting to swallow him whole. His wife's absence was a scar he wore beneath his jacket, but Sophie, with her gap-toothed grin, held up a tattered map she'd drawn in crayon, declaring it their guide to home. This is the story of a father and daughter navigating loss and love, in a place where every corner held a memory and every memory held a fight. The bus hissed as it came to a stop at the edge of town, its windows clouded with the damp breath of strangers. Outside, the sky sagged low, a heavy gray pressing down on the flat roofs and empty sidewalks. Michael Hayes stepped down onto the cracked pavement, the soles of his boots meeting the familiar grit of a place he had not touched in years. The driver closed the door behind him, and the bus pulled away without ceremony, the taillights shrinking into the pale distance until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind brushing the brittle weeds. He stood there for a long moment with the weight of a faded canvas pack dragging at his shoulder. In his other hand, he held a small paratrooper teddy bear, its once bright fabric dulled and softened from years of travel. He didn't look at it. His thumb just rubbed the worn seam along its back, a habit he had picked up somewhere between desert nights and makeshift barracks. The air was sharp, tinged with wood smoke from unseen chimneys and the faint mineral tang of snow that had melted and frozen again. The road into town stretched straight ahead, flanked by houses that seemed caught in a slow exhale. Paint had flaked from their siding, curtains hung limp in unlit windows, porches sagged under the weight of time. Each step Michael took sent a small crunch through the frost-dusted gravel, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the stillness. No voices, no car doors slamming, only the occasional groan of a weathered signpost shifting in the wind. He passed the corner store where, years ago, a younger version of himself had bought coffee before work, his hands still smelling faintly of gun oil from a night shift. The windows now were dark, the open sign hanging crooked, a faded poster for last summer's county fair peeled away from the glass, edges fluttering as if trying to let go. There was a strange double vision to it all, the town he remembered and the town in front of him, overlaid like mismatched transparencies. Every house, every empty bench seemed to carry a shadow of what had once been there. A neighbor's laugh, the sound of a screen door banging shut, the hum of a radio spilling through a kitchen window. But the present offered none of that. The present was hollow, a stage stripped of its actors. Michael shifted the pack higher on his shoulder, his fingers tightening around the teddy bear. The wind caught the brim of his cap, pressing it down against his forehead, and he kept walking. He didn't hurry. The road to his old house was short in miles, but long in the way it drew him through the silence, past memories that rose unbidden, his daughter's first bike ride down these same sidewalks, Anna waiting at the gate with a paper cup of coffee, the dog they used to have barking at every passerby. Those images flickered and faded before he could hold them. In their place came the slow ache of returning to a place that had kept moving without him, however quietly. He felt the edges of his world tightening in, as though the town had shrunk in his absence. The wind shifted, carrying with it the dry scent of frozen earth from the fields beyond. Somewhere far off, a truck engine coughed to life, then fell silent. Michael paused, letting his eyes travel down the long, narrow street toward the bend where the roofline of his old home would soon come into view. For an instant, he wondered if he'd made a mistake coming back, not in leaving the service, not in choosing this place, but in thinking he could ever step into the same life again. There were things the war had taken that no key could unlock, no familiar road could return. Still, he started forward again. The teddy bear swung lightly from his grip, catching the weak afternoon light. He didn't know exactly what waited around the bend. Emptiness, welcome, something in between, but his boots found the rhythm of the road. The cold air filled his lungs, stung his eyes. Somewhere ahead, in the unseen distance, there was a house he still called his. Whether it could still hold the word home, he would find out soon enough. For now, the wind was at his back, and the road was steady beneath his feet. That was enough to keep walking. The road bent slightly after the old water tower, its rusted frame leaning as if tired from years of holding itself up. Michael followed it, boots striking a muted beat against the cracked pavement. The sky had shifted, clouds pulling apart in slow, uneven drifts, letting thin blades of light spill onto the fields at the edge of town. The light didn't warm much. It only revealed more of what the years had done. He passed the Carter place, or what was left of it. The front porch steps had sagged inward, one rail gone entirely. A child's plastic truck sat overturned in the yard, half buried in last year's leaves. No one had lived there for seasons, maybe longer. A mailbox leaned forward as though listening for a voice that never came. The wind picked up again, sharp enough to bring tears to his eyes, but Michael kept his head up. He wanted to take in every detail, even the ones that made his chest tighten. That was part of coming home, seeing what had changed and what had been left to fade. As the road narrowed, it shifted from asphalt to hard-packed dirt. His boots pressed faint prints into the frosty surface. To the left, a row of elms stood stripped and skeletal, their branches knitting against the gray sky. In summer, those trees had formed a canopy that shaded the way to his house. He remembered walking under them with Anna on warm evenings, Sophie asleep in the stroller, the air smelling of cut grass and distant barbecue. That memory rose so vividly he could almost hear the squeak of the stroller wheels. Almost. Now, the only sound was the creak of a loose sign swinging from a single nail outside what had once been Mabel's diner. The windows were dusted over from the inside, the booths faintly visible in the gloom. A cracked neon coffee sign still hung in one corner, lifeless. He felt a pull in his gut, not nostalgia exactly, but the recognition that even the places meant to hold the rhythms of everyday life had been stilled. Michael adjusted the strap of his pack, shifting its weight. The teddy bear in his hand brushed against his leg with each step, a small, repetitive comfort. He found himself counting the remaining houses to his own, not because he was in a hurry, but because each one was like a quiet checkpoint, a piece of proof that he was still moving forward. Number 34 had its shutters nailed shut. Number 36's roof sagged under years of snow and rain. Number 38 was wrapped in the smell of chimney smoke, though no movement stirred behind its curtains. The homes were lined up like silent witnesses, each holding its own private story. And for a moment, Michael felt as though he was walking through the memory of a town rather than the town itself. When he rounded the last curve, the sight of his own gate stopped him. The paint, once white, had peeled down to bare wood in wide strips. The hinges rusted deep orange. The latch hung loose, as if someone had forced it one too many times. Beyond it, the yard had gone to seed, grass uncut, weeds pressing up through cracks in the walkway. He stood there a long time, one boot toe nudging a stray bottle cap half buried in the dirt. The wind made the old chain-link fence rattle faintly. In his mind, he could still see Sophie running across that yard, hair flying, Anna calling after her from a porch. That image hovered in the space between his eyes and the house itself, making the present look both sharper and harder to bear. The front door was still there, but the paint had dulled to a tired, uneven color. He could imagine his hand on the knob, the slow turn, the first breath of air from inside. But he didn't move yet. There was a pull in his chest. Not fear, not exactly hesitation, but the realization that once he crossed that threshold, he would know for sure whether what he'd been carrying home was still here, or if it had only ever been a memory. A gust stirred the weeds along the walkway, carrying with it the faint scent of dry earth and old timber. It was the same smell he remembered from his childhood, but it felt distant now, like something borrowed from someone else's life. Michael let his eyes travel from the door to the small window beside it, curtains drawn tight. There was no movement, no shadow, no sign. The silence pressed in, steady and patient. He shifted the teddy bear to his other hand, felt the soft wear in its fabric. That bear had been across continents, tucked into rucksacks, squeezed tight during long nights under foreign skies. Now it was here, just a few steps from the place it had left with him years ago. He didn't feel ready, but readiness didn't matter. The road had carried him this far, through streets stripped of their voices, past the ghosts of his own memories, and up to this door. Whether there was welcome behind it or nothing at all, he would open it. Michael reached for the gate, the metal cold and gritty under his fingers. It gave easily, swinging inward without a sound. He stepped through, the crunch of gravel under his boots the only mark of his arrival. The house loomed closer with each slow step, its weathered face holding the weight of every season he had missed. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at the door. For a moment, he let his gaze drift past it, to the thin line of sky visible above the roofline. Pale, uncertain, but clearing. Then he took the first step up. Whatever waited on the other side, it was part of the road he had chosen to walk back. And in the quiet space between that thought and his next breath, he felt something shift, not enough to be peace, but enough to keep going. The first knock sounded softer than he intended. The weight of his hand measured by something in him that didn't want to startle the quiet. It was the kind of quiet you could hear under your own breath, layered, settled, and aware. He stood there on the porch with his shoulders squared, his boots leaving a damp trace of frost melt on the boards. No footsteps approached from the other side, just the muted creak of the wind tugging at the eaves. He adjusted his stance, the faded teddy bear hanging from his hand like an anchor, and knocked again. The sound was swallowed almost immediately, as though the house itself had forgotten how to answer. He thought of all the doors he'd opened over the last years, battered plywood and desert outposts, warped metal and rain-soaked barracks, each time with his senses tuned for the unknown waiting beyond. But this one felt heavier, even without resistance. He knew the weight came from something less visible, the possibility of absence, the risk that the house was only a shell now, stripped of the life he'd been holding onto in memory. Then the knob turned. The door opened just far enough for him to see her. Anna stood framed in the dim hallway light, her hair pinned back neatly, a dark coat falling straight to her knees. Her face was made up in soft, neutral tones, the kind of effort you make when you want to be seen as composed, untouched by the day's weather. Her eyes found his, but they didn't widen. No smile rose. She looked at him as though he had been expected in theory, but not in the flesh. The pause between them was long enough for him to hear the tick of the hallway clock behind her. In that moment, he thought about what he had pictured on the bus. The doors swinging open, Sophie's laughter spilling out, and his arms around them both. He thought of how that image had kept him warm in cold places. And he saw, in one glance, that the picture didn't exist here. Anna shifted her weight, and for the first time he noticed the object in her hand, a neat stack of papers clipped together at the corner. She held them the way someone holds an errand, something to pass along before moving on. Michael's mouth formed a small breath of words, though not much more than air escaped. "I'm home." The syllables felt too plain for the weight they carried. Anna didn't answer. Instead, she lowered her eyes to the papers, then extended them toward him with a motion that was neither abrupt nor tender. Behind her, he could see his suitcase propped against the wall, its handle raised. The kind of preparation that meant departure was not a matter of if, but when. He took in the sight of it the way you take in a weather report before a storm. Factual, unavoidable. The smell of the hallway reached him, faint perfume layered over the dry, closed-in air of a house sealed against winter. He could feel the threshold like a drawn line under his boots. He didn't step forward. His fingers hovered over the papers, the teddy bear still in his other hand, its soft ear pressed into his palm. Somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard creaked, a sound that stirred something old and restless in him, but he couldn't place it yet. Anna's gaze stayed low, on the space between them. The silence stretched. In another life, in another doorway, he might have closed that distance, asked the questions, bridged the air with something human. Here, now, it felt like trying to step onto a road that had already washed out in the rain. He took the papers. The clip was cold from the air, the pages stiff. His eyes didn't scan them yet. The block of text meant nothing compared to the simple fact of their presence. The truth they carried was already in the way her shoulders squared, the way her stance angled toward the driveway beyond the porch. The wind shifted, sending a chill through the small gap between them. Michael tightened his grip on the bear, the seam pressing into his knuckles. He thought of the times he'd rehearsed this moment in his head during deployment. The different versions of her face, the imagined words, the longed-for welcome. None of them matched what stood in front of him now. This was something pared down to essentials. A man at a door, a woman with papers, a threshold that no longer marked the same side for both. Anna stepped back half a pace, not as an invitation, but as space-making. He could see past her to the narrow hallway, the familiar coat hooks on the wall. One still holding the green scarf Sophie used to wind around her neck twice before going outside. For a flicker of a moment, that sight pulled at him, not toward her, but toward the idea of life still inside these walls. The hallway clock ticked again, steady, impartial. Somewhere behind it, out of sight, the house waited to see what he would do next. He didn't cross the threshold yet. He stood there, holding the papers in one hand, the bear in the other, feeling the air of the home he'd left wrap around him without touching. The scent, the light, the quiet deepened, and he realized that whatever words might come now, they would not change the shape of this moment. It had already been decided, long before the sound of his knock. He stepped back just enough for the wind to pass between them, the cold threading into his sleeves. The house stood still, holding its breath. Somewhere behind that closed expression, perhaps she knew that part of him had come home, but not the part she remembered. And somewhere in him, he knew the same. The papers weighed more in his hand now, though nothing had been added. He looked down at them once, then up past the doorway to where the thin winter light angled between two clouds. It was fading fast, but there would be more of it tomorrow. He let that thought settle, not as comfort, but as a point to walk toward when the porch steps felt steady again. The edge of the porch step creaked under his heel as he shifted his weight. He had not planned what to do with the papers. There had been no script in his head for this version of the return. They were heavier than they looked, the way a folded flag is heavier than the fabric alone. He stood still, letting the cold from the open doorway brush his face, while Anna's presence filled the narrow gap between indoors and out. The sound came first, the low growl of an engine at idle. Then the reflection of chrome caught his eye from the street. A black sedan, glossy even under the winter haze, sat by the curb. The driver's side window rolled down partway, revealing the corner of a gold watch against a white cuff. The man in the seat tapped his fingers on the wheel, a rhythm that matched nothing in the scene except perhaps his own impatience. Anna's gaze flicked toward the car, then back to Michael, and in that motion was everything unsaid. She had somewhere to be, someone waiting. The suitcase by the wall was not for storage. It was for departure. The hallway light glinted faintly on the metal pull handle. Michael looked down at the papers in his hand. His breath clouded faintly in the cool air, dissolving between them. He let the papers hang at his side, his fingers loosening just enough that the top page curled in the breeze. The teddy bear's ear brushed his knuckles. Anna adjusted her coat collar with her free hand. He caught a faint scent of her perfume, not the one she wore when they first met, but a sharper, more polished note. It sat strangely over the memory of her skin warmed by summer air, the memory that still lived somewhere in him. The years between them were not measured just in days and months, but in the different lives they had carried separately. He had carried deserts and dust storms, the weight of a rifle and the silence after orders were given. She had carried, he didn't know, maybe city lights, maybe new hands, maybe just the absence of waiting for news she feared would come. The driver leaned forward, resting an arm over the wheel, watching without interest. The street beyond them was empty except for a few leaves caught in a shallow eddy of wind, scraping along the curb. The sound was small, but in the stillness it filled the space between the three of them. Anna took one step forward, enough that the toe of her shoe was almost to the threshold. "You'll keep the house," she said quietly, though it was less a question than a placement of fact. Her eyes slid to the teddy bear, then away, as if she'd remembered something but decided not to share it. Michael gave a small nod, not agreement, Not refusal, just acknowledgement. Words seemed too heavy to carry over the short distance between them, and too fragile to survive the cold air. She glanced toward the car again. The man in the driver's seat shifted, his hand now on the gear shift. The hum of the engine deepened. Anna's coat swayed slightly as she turned toward the steps. She didn't look back until she reached the porch edge, and even then it was only a half turn, enough to register that he was still standing in the doorway, holding those papers. The bear's head drooping from his hand. When her foot hit the gravel path, the sound was sharp. Michael kept his eyes on the place where her hand had gripped the doorframe. A faint smudge of warmth against the cold wood. The sedan door opened briefly for her to set the suitcase inside. Then she slid into the passenger seat. The door shut with a muted thud. The car pulled away without haste, its tires finding the smoother patches in the road. The red of the taillights glowed briefly against the muted colors of the street, then dimmed as the distance grew. Michael stood in the doorway until they disappeared around the bend past the elm trees. The papers were still in his hand, edges softening under his grip. He stepped back inside just far enough to close the door. The click of the latch sounded final, but not in a way that brought resolution. He set the bear on the small table by the wall, beside an unused lamp. The house smelled faintly of dust and a winter that had stayed shut in. He lowered himself onto the edge of the couch, the springs giving a tired groan. His eyes moved over the room. The furniture was the same, the walls the same, but the air felt thinner somehow, as though it had been breathed out and never replaced. He didn't unfold the papers. Not yet. They could wait until the silence settled into something less jagged. Outside, a faint gust rattled the loose pane in the front window. Somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked, maybe from the shift in temperature, maybe from memory pressing at the edges. Michael leaned back, the couch cushion sagging under his weight. His gaze drifted to the ceiling where a faint water stain bloomed in the corner, the shape of it unfamiliar but inevitable. He thought of repairs, of chores waiting, of what needed to be done to make this house something more than walls. But for now, he simply sat, the weight of the papers on his thigh, the cold still lingering in his sleeves. The sound of the departing engine had long since faded, yet its echo remained somewhere in his chest. Through the front window, he could see the pale line of the road stretching away. The clouds above it had begun to break apart, letting thin, uneven shafts of light fall over the yard. He watched one spill across the gate, the peeling paint catching a momentary glint. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to, not as an answer, but as a direction. The silence after the car was not complete. It had a texture to it, like a thin blanket over an empty room. Michael stayed seated for a while, the papers resting loosely in his lap, one corner bent where his thumb pressed without thought. Somewhere in the kitchen, a drip from the faucet struck the steel of the sink at intervals slow enough to measure time by. The air inside the house felt still, as though it hadn't been moved by conversation in a long while. Then, faint and quick, the sound of running feet. It came from the hallway, a light, uneven rhythm that matched a stride too short to belong to anyone grown. Michael's head turned before his mind caught up. He set the papers on the arm of the couch and rose to his feet just as Sophie rounded the corner. She was smaller than his memory had made her, and yet somehow bigger, her face narrower, the line of her jaw a little sharper than when he'd last traced it in his mind. The sleeves of her faded sweater hung a bit long, her hands half hidden in the frayed cuffs. The sweater was the color of old wool left in sunlight too long, but it was clean, and it held the smell of the yard and the faint sweetness of soap. Her hair was loose and a little tangled, with a stubborn curl that had freed itself from the rest and bounced near her cheek as she ran. She didn't call his name. She just moved toward him in a straight line, her eyes wide and fixed. There was no pause, no hesitation, no scan of his face to confirm. When she reached him, the impact was small in force but large in weight. She buried her head against his chest, her arms circling his middle with a grip that spoke of certainty, not surprise. Michael felt the breath go out of him, not from the force but from the sudden rush of recognition, of her scent, Her warmth, the slight tremor of her small body after the run. He let his arms fold around her, one hand at the back of her head, the other across her shoulders. The top of her hair brushed his chin, and for a moment his eyes closed, shutting out the room, the hallway, the papers, the absence left by the car's departure. In that pocket of stillness, there was only the feel of her heartbeat pressed against him, and the unspoken knowledge that, despite everything stripped away, this remained. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees, the branches scraping lightly against one another like dry whispers. Sophie shifted just enough to tilt her face upward. Her eyes, the same deep color he remembered, searched his for a second, but she didn't speak. She seemed to understand that words could only shrink what she was trying to say. Michael's thumb traced a slow line along the curve of her shoulder through the wool. Her sweater was warm, the kind of warmth that seeps into your own skin if you let it. He realized then how cold his hands had been until that moment. A sound escaped him, not quite a sigh and not quite speech. He felt the tightness in his chest ease just enough to allow breath to move freely again. He had been standing in this house for minutes, but it wasn't until now, with Sophie's arms around him, that he felt the floor steady beneath him. The smell of her hair brought back mornings before deployment, the two of them at the kitchen table, her swinging her legs under the chair while he tied her shoes, the sun slanting through the blinds. Those mornings had seemed ordinary then. Now they felt like a kind of wealth he hadn't known he'd owned until it was gone. Sophie pressed her cheek more firmly against him, and he adjusted his stance so she could stay like that without strain. He noticed the uneven patch on her sweater's left elbow, stitched by a hand less practiced but careful. Maybe Anna had done it. Maybe someone else. He didn't ask. The ticking of the hallway clock was louder now, or perhaps he was simply hearing it over the slowing pace of his own pulse. The house still smelled of its closed-up winter air, but with Sophie there, pressed close, it was easier to breathe. He knew there were questions. He knew there were changes he hadn't yet seen in her. In the house, in himself. But the questions could wait. Change could wait. Right now, there was only the fact that she had run to him without hesitation, without needing to be sure first. Michael bent his head slightly, letting his cheek rest against the crown of her head. He didn't speak. The silence between them was full enough, not empty, not lacking, but filled with the simple fact of presence. From the window, a thin shaft of winter light reached the floor at their feet, stretching toward them as if trying to take part in the moment. Dust motes moved lazily in its path, caught in the air they were sharing. He didn't move to break the embrace. The world could stay on the other side of the front door a while longer. Michael didn't remember moving toward the couch, but somehow they ended up there, the two of them still holding on to each other as though the rest of the room didn't exist. He sat back slowly, letting Sophie settle into the curve of his arm, her small frame fitting into him as naturally as if there had been no years apart. The old couch springs groaned under their combined weight, but neither paid attention. She rested her head against his chest, her ear over his heart, as though listening to its rhythm was enough to confirm he was real. Her legs curled under her, toes brushing the edge of his thigh. The teddy bear he'd carried all this way now lay in her lap, its worn fabric looking almost new against the pale wool of her sweater. She stroked its head absent-mindedly. The way you touch something you already understand belongs to you. The room was dim, the winter afternoon light falling through a slit in the curtains and stretching across the floor in a long rectangle. Dust floated through the beam, each particle turning slowly as though unsure where to land. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator motor clicked on, a low hum filling the quiet. Michael's hand moved in slow, steady circles over Sophie's back. He could feel the warmth of her body through the thin knit of her sweater, the rise and fall of her breath. It seeped into him, undoing a little more of the stiffness that had wrapped itself around him since he'd stepped off the bus. It wasn't the loud relief of a reunion imagined on battlefields. It was quieter, more grounding. He noticed the faint scent of soap in her hair, mingled with the crisp smell of the outdoors, that peculiar mix of winter air and dry leaves. It reminded him of the mornings he'd walked her to preschool, the way she would tilt her head back to catch snowflakes, grinning when they melted on her cheeks. His eyes moved over the room, tracing the familiar lines of the walls and furniture. The coffee table still bore a faint ring from the mug he'd once set down too hot. The rug had worn thin in the same place where Sophie used to sit with her picture books. But the house was quieter now, as if it had adjusted to breathing without laughter for too long. Sophie shifted in his arms, adjusting the teddy bear's position so that its stitched face looked up at her. She didn't say anything, and he didn't press her to. Her silence wasn't avoidance. It was comfort, the way you sit with someone when words aren't necessary. Outside, the wind rattled the branches of the elm in the yard. A few brittle leaves scraped against the siding, the sound faint but persistent. Michael's gaze followed the noise to the window, where the light was already softening toward evening. He thought about the road that had led him here, not just the miles from deployment, but the years of counting down to this idea of home. Now that he was inside it, he understood that the return was not an instant crossing, but a slow, deliberate thing. You didn't step back into your life in a single moment. You eased into it, or it eased into you, one breath at a time. The warmth of Sophie against him anchored that thought. He realized he could sit like this for hours and not feel the urge to move, not feel the need to fill the air with anything more than her steady breathing. On the far wall, the clock ticked, its hands moving with the same indifference they'd had while he was gone. Time had kept its own pace here, unbothered by absence or return. He wondered if Sophie measured time differently, not in hours or days, but in the distance between hugs. The faint smell of something metallic drifted in from the kitchen, the old radiator kicking in, pipes expanding with heat. It joined the other small sounds of the house, each one slowly reminding him that the building was still alive in its own way. Sophie's fingers paused on the teddy bear's head. She shifted again, tucking herself closer into his side. He felt the weight of her trust in that movement, and with it the sense that whatever else had changed, this connection had not been broken. The light in the room deepened, the beam on the floor shrinking until it was just a thin strip. Shadows gathered in the corners, softening the edges of the furniture. Michael let his head rest back against the couch cushion, his hands still moving slowly over Sophie's back. He thought of all the places he'd been where warmth came from shared blanket or a campfire, always temporary, always ready to be abandoned at the next order. This was different. This was the kind of warmth that stayed, that you build a life around instead of breaking it down for parts. For the first time since stepping off the bus, Michael felt a thin thread connecting him to something ahead. Not the past he'd lost, but a future that might be shaped one small act at a time. It wasn't certainty, but it was enough. He drew the teddy bear closer to Sophie's chest, her small hands curling around it instinctively. His arm tightened around her, just slightly, sealing the moment as if to keep it from slipping away. In the deepening quiet, the world outside could wait. Morning came without ceremony. No alarm clock, no metallic slam of a mess hall door. Just a thin light creeping in around the edges of the curtains and the faint sound of a bird somewhere in the leafless elm out front. Michael opened his eyes to the muted colors of the living room. The worn rug, the table with its uneven leg, Sophie curled on the couch beneath the quilt Mrs. Grant must have left at some point. The air still held the coolness of night, but it was a cool that belonged to a house, not to a tent pitched under foreign stars. He eased himself upright, careful not to wake her. She had her arms slung over the teddy bear, cheek pressed to its head. Her hair spilled in a soft tangle across her face. It was the kind of image you don't disturb unless you have to. The kind you let rest so you can carry it with you for the harder mornings. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he crossed to the kitchen. The room was smaller than he remembered. Or maybe he had just gotten used to places that never felt like his. The counter bore a few mismatched mugs, a chip plate, and a jar of instant coffee that looked like it had been opened a long time ago. He filled the kettle with cold tap water, the metallic taste of the pipes already on his tongue from habit. Steam rose slowly, curling into the cool air. He poured it over the coffee granules, watching the dark swirls expand before settling. The smell was familiar, though weaker than the brews overseas that could strip paint if you let them sit. He took a slow sip, letting the heat work its way down. Through the doorway, he could see Sophie stir, one leg kicking the quilt aside. She sat up, blinking into the light, her small hand rubbing at her eyes. For a moment, she looked at him like she was checking if the night before had been real. Then she slid off the couch and padded toward him, bare feet whispering against the floor. He poured a little warm milk into a chipped mug for her, something she could wrap her hand around. She didn't speak, and he didn't ask any of the questions that crowded at the edges of his mind. They drank in companionable quiet, the ticking of the kitchen clock stretching out the space between them. Later, he stepped outside while she sat at the table with a stub of pencil and a sheet of paper. The morning air bit at his skin, and the frost clung stubbornly to the tips of the grass. The neighborhood looked the same as it had when he arrived. Houses closed up tight, driveways empty. Somewhere, a dog barked once, and then went quiet again. He walked to the side of the house, inspecting the loose gutter that sagged above the porch. A small list began to form in his head. Patch the roof, fix the gutter, rehang the back door. It wasn't the kind of list he'd made for years. No coordinates, no gear checks, but it had the same quiet gravity. Each task was a way of holding ground, of proving to himself that staying was possible. Back inside, Sophie was bent over her paper, tongue peeking out at the corner of her mouth in concentration. She had drawn a square with a triangle on top, a house, and inside it 2 stick figures. One taller, one smaller, both with wide, looping smiles. The teddy bear sat on the table beside her. Watching over the scene, Michael set a hand lightly on her shoulder, the warmth of her small frame seeping into his palm. She looked up at him briefly, then back to her drawing, as if to say she wasn't finished yet. He let her be, moving to the sink to wash their mugs. The water was slow to warm, so he scrubbed with the cold. The sting in his fingers a reminder of mornings in other places. The day passed without rush. He found himself adjusting to the pace of a house that didn't demand urgency. A trip to Tom Bennett's shop to ask about work. A stop at the small grocery for bread and eggs. Sophie at his side, her small hand gripping 2 of his fingers instead of the whole hand. In the afternoon, they sat on the back steps eating sandwiches. The air smelled faintly of chimney, smoke drifting from somewhere down the block. Sophie leaned against him, her head resting against his arm, chewing slowly as she watched a pair of crows hop along the fence line. Michael didn't speak of the past or of plans. He let the minutes stretch, the sky shifting from a pale winter blue to the deeper shade that comes before evening. Somewhere in the quiet, he realized that first days back weren't about picking up where you left off. They were about learning to stand still again without bracing for the next order. When the sun finally slid low, they went inside. Sophie pulled the quilt back over the couch, arranging it just so before curling under it again with the teddy bear. Michael sat in the armchair across from her, boots off, feeling the weight in his shoulders ease fractionally. It wasn't home yet, not fully, but it was no longer foreign. By the 3rd morning, the air inside the house had shifted. It was still winter still carried the faint scent of disuse. But there was a thread of warmth in it now, not from the old radiator, but from the quiet routines beginning to knit themselves back together. Michael rose before Sophie, not because he had to, but because his body was trained to wake with the gray light. In the Army, mornings were measured in commands and checklists. Here, they were marked by the small scrape of the kitchen chair as he pulled it out from the table, the rattle of the coffee tin as he pried it open. He washed his hands at the sink, the water still slow to warm, then set about preparing breakfast. A saucepan of oats bubbled quietly on the stove, the wooden spoon moving in a slow figure 8. He found himself counting the turns the way he used to count rotations of a gun barrel when cleaning it, steady, methodical, oddly calming. Sophie patted in just as the smell of the oats thickened. Her hair sleep-tousled, the hem of her sweater brushing her knees. She climbed into her chair without a word, the teddy bear landing beside her with a soft thud. Michael set a bowl in front of her, steam curling upward into her face. She blew on it with exaggerated care, and he caught the faintest smile at the corner of her mouth. After breakfast, he walked her to Mrs. Grant's. 3 houses down. The old woman stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick cardigan, her hair pinned back in its usual tidy bun. She greeted Sophie with the easy familiarity of someone who had been a steady fixture in the child's life. For Michael, she offered only a nod and a brief, appraising look that carried more understanding than words would have. The walk back to the house was quiet. He noticed things he hadn't before, the way the frost clung to the edges of mailboxes, the faint indentation of tire tracks left in the dirt shoulder, a half-broken bird feeder swaying in a breeze. These were the kinds of details he would have scanned for threat in another setting. Here, they were simply markers of place, of living. Inside, he tackled the loose hinge on the back door. It squealed in protest when he unscrewed it, the metal cold and stubborn. In the past, fixing a door would have been nothing. Here, it felt like a way of reclaiming a corner of his life. He replaced the hinge, tightened the screws, and tested the swing until it moved without noise. By noon, he was at Tom Bennett's shop. The smell of motor oil and dust hit him as soon as he stepped inside, a familiar mix that belonged to another kind of work. Tom didn't ask many questions. He just handed Michael a rag and pointed to an old pickup in the corner that needed its oil changed. The motions came back quickly, the crouch, the turn of the wrench, the feel of the metal warming under his hands. It was almost like muscle memory, but slower, tempered by time away. When the shift ended, Michael didn't linger. The sun was already low, the shadows stretching long across the road as he walked back. Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table when he returned, a handful of crayons scattered around her. She was drawing a house again. But this time, there was smoke curling from the chimney, and the stick figures inside had something between them, a small, lopsided heart. He set his keys on the counter and moved to stand behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She didn't look up, but her posture eased under his touch. The colors on the page were bright against the grainy surface of the paper, red for the heart. The sound of forks against plates. The scrape of her chair as she carried her dish to the sink without being told. He washed, she dried, and though they spoke little, the rhythm between them felt almost practiced. Later, in the living room, she curled on the couch with a quilt, the teddy bear tucked under her chin. Michael sat nearby with a small pile of mail, bills, flyers, the usual detritus of life, and sorted through it with deliberate slowness. Every so often, he glanced toward her, watching her eyes grow heavy. By the time he carried her to bed, the house was quiet again, but it was a different quiet than the one he'd met when he first walked through the door. This quiet was layered with breath, with the residue of a day lived together. Michael stood for a while in the doorway to her room, the faint light from the hall spilling across her face. She was already asleep, one hand resting on the teddy bear, the other curled loosely near her cheek. He thought about the mornings to come, about how habits take root without fanfare. Downstairs, he turned off the kitchen light and paused to listen to the hum of the radiator, the ticking of the clock. They were small sounds, but together they formed a kind of heartbeat for the house. For the first time in a long while, he felt himself matching its pace. The day had been the kind that passed without making a sound. No sharp turns, no sudden news. Just the slow movement of winter light across the walls. By late afternoon, a pale gold settled over the street, washing the houses in a kind of tired warmth. Michael had been tightening a loose floorboard in the kitchen when he caught the shift of that light through the front window. It pulled at something in him, an old instinct to step outside before the sun slid away. Sophie was in the living room, sprawled on the rug with her crayons. The teddy bear sat propped beside her, overseeing her latest drawing. She looked up when he crossed the front door, but didn't ask where he was going. Maybe she sensed it wasn't the kind of leaving that needed explanation. The porch boards felt cool under his boots. He lowered himself onto the top step, the wood giving a slight groan under his weight. The air smelled faintly of smoke from a chimney down the block, layered over with a sharper scent of cold earth. Out beyond the gate, the dirt road lay still, except for a single gust that stirred the leaves caught along the fence line. He let his elbows rest on his knees, hands clasped loosely, and watched the light gather on the horizon. In the distance, a dog barked twice, then fell quiet. Somewhere closer, a screen door opened and shut, the sound of evening settling into its familiar rhythms. From inside, he could hear the soft scratch of crayon on paper, the little pauses Sophie took when she stopped to think about what to draw next. That sound reached him through the half-open door like a reminder. She was here, safe, in the warm spill of the living room lamp. He didn't have to keep her in his line of sight every second anymore, but the habit of knowing her position was hard to shake. He leaned back slightly, letting his gaze travel to the elm tree at the edge of the yard. Its bare branches caught the last of the light, the tips glowing for a moment before fading into shadow. The wind moved through them in a way that sounded almost like whispering. A bicycle rolled past on the road, its tires crunching over gravel. The rider, a boy of maybe 12, glanced toward the house but didn't slow. Michael's eyes followed until the boy disappeared around a bend. He thought about all the porches he'd sat on in other places, makeshift ones built from shipping pallets, concrete stoops outside prefab barracks. Those were places to keep watch, to wait for orders, to measure the quiet in seconds between sounds. This was different. Here, the quiet didn't need to be measured. It just was. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows from the fence posts across the yard. He could feel the temperature dropping, the kind of chill that settles into your sleeves first. Still, he didn't move to go inside. The screen door creaked, and Sophie stepped out, holding her drawing carefully between both hands. She wore her sweater over a mismatched pair of leggings, and her socks sagged around her ankles. She didn't say anything, just crossed the porch and lowered herself onto the step beside him. She laid the paper across his knee. Two stick figures stood in front of Square House, a smaller rectangle in the yard that might have been the porch they were sitting on now. Above them, the sky was filled with blue crayon strokes, uneven but insistent. Michael took in the drawing without comment, the weight of her leaning against his arm. She didn't look up at him, and he didn't try to catch her eye. Instead, he let his free hand rest lightly on her back, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing as she gazed out at the road. They sat like that until the gold in the sky faded to gray, until the first porch light on the street flickered on. The cold began to seep through the boards, but neither of them moved right away. It wasn't the kind of moment you rushed. Eventually, Sophie folded the drawing and slipped it under her arm. Michael rose, offering her his hand without a word. She took it, her small fingers curling around his. Together they stepped back inside, the door closing gently behind them. The warmth of the living room wrapped around them, but he carried the outside air with him for a while, the smell of wood smoke, the scrape of leaves, the fading echo of a bicycle wheel on gravel. They settled into the evening with those things stitched quietly into the fabric of the house. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of day where the sky held the color of tin and the cold pressed itself against the windows. Michael had been repairing a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen when a knock came at the front door. 2 short raps, deliberate but not urgent. When he opened it, Clara Doyle stood there, her camera slung across her chest, breath fogging in the air. She was young, maybe late 20s, with the look of someone who saw stories in the corners where other people saw nothing. She explained, quietly, not wanting to intrude, that she was walking by and had noticed the light on the porch, the way it fell across the open doorway. She asked if she could take a picture, not of the house exactly, but of the way it felt. Michael wasn't sure what that meant, but he nodded anyway. He had learned that sometimes letting people do their small work was easier than asking them to explain it. She stepped inside just far enough to frame the living room. Sophie sat cross-legged on the rug, the quilt pulled around her, coloring with the stub of a crayon she'd been using for days. The teddy bear leaned against her knee like a silent partner. Clara lifted the camera slowly, almost reverently, and clicked the shutter once. The sound was soft, but Sophie looked up. Clara lowered the camera immediately, offering a small smile. Sophie didn't smile back, but she didn't frown either, just returned to her drawing, the tip of the crayon scratching against paper. Clara thanked Michael and stepped back out into the cold. The whole thing lasted less than 2 minutes, but the image stayed with him long after the door closed. He wondered what it would look like. Frozen in a frame, the colors muted by winter light, the edges softened. 2 days later, the photograph appeared online. Michael found it by accident. Tom Bennett mentioned it while they were under the hood of a pickup, then showed him on his phone. The picture was simple, a child in a dimly lit room, wrapped in a quilt, with a stuffed bear and a sheet of paper in her lap. But it was the light, the way it spilled across her face from the half-open door, catching the dust in the air, that made people stop scrolling. The caption was only 4 words, "She's safe now." Finally, it spread faster than he expected. Comments from strangers began to collect beneath it, people sending well wishes, prayers, stories of their own returns. Someone said the photograph reminded them of their daughter waiting for them after a long deployment. Another said it looked like a still from a film they wished was real. Michael didn't reply to any of them. He didn't even tell Sophie about the photograph. She wouldn't have understood the way strangers could hold a piece of you in their minds without ever meeting you. Still, when they walked to the store that week, he noticed a woman behind the counter glance at Sophie a moment too long, her eyes softening in recognition. At home, life moved the same. Breakfast at the small table. Sophie's walks to Mrs. Grant's. Evenings fixing what needed fixing in the house. But in the quiet moments, when he saw her absorbed in drawing, or when she leaned against him on the porch, he thought about the photograph, about how it had turned something ordinary into something people carried with them. One evening, just before bed, Sophie came to him with a piece of paper. She had drawn two figures again, this time sitting side by side under a porch light. Between them, a rectangle floated in the air. At first, he thought it was a window, but then he realized it was her attempt at a photograph, a moment captured, suspended above them. He didn't ask if she'd seen it somewhere, or if she'd simply felt it. Instead, he took the drawing and pinned it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. The next morning, the air was sharp with frost. As they left the house, he glanced back at the porch. The light was still on from the night before, casting a pale glow against the doorframe. For the first time, he thought about turning it off, not because the moment was gone, but because they had already carried it inside with them. Some things didn't need to be lit from the outside anymore. By late February, the days had begun to stretch, but the light was still thin, a watery, reluctant thing that seemed to hover just above the horizon before slipping away. Michael had been paying attention to the sky more than usual, not out of habit from his years away, but because here the sky was the best measure of what was coming. That morning, when he stepped onto the porch with his coffee, the air was sharp in his lungs, and the wind had a different edge. It carried the smell of snow, though the ground was still bare. Somewhere off to the west, low clouds were building, flat-bellied and moving slow but steady. The radio in the kitchen murmured about a winter storm advisory, nothing unusual for the season, but enough to set a quiet tension in the town. Inside, Sophie was still at the table, her legs swinging as she ate her cereal. The spoon clinked against the bowl in a rhythm that seemed to keep her company. Michael watched her for a moment, the way she leaned forward, concentrating on each bite, as if the day's work was to finish breakfast before the milk turned warm. He let her be, moving through his own small preparations, checking the flashlight drawer, pulling an extra quilt from the closet, making sure the space heater in her room still worked. He did these things without urgency, but also without pause. Years of living by readiness didn't fade just because the dangers were quieter now. At Tom Bennett's shop, the conversation was all about the storm. Men with grease under their nails speculated on whether the plows would come early enough, on how many inches they'd see before morning. Michael kept mostly to his work, his hands wrapped around a socket wrench, but his ears caught every word. The talk was half tradition, half ritual, a way of bracing without admitting worry. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up. He could hear it through the thin garage walls, a steady hum with the occasional sharp whistle when it slipped through a crack. He thought about Sophie, about the walk from Mrs. Grant's back home, and decided to leave early. When he reached Mrs. Grant's, Sophie was by the window, watching something in the yard. Her breath fogged the glass in short bursts. She turned when she saw him and ran to get her coat, the sleeves bunching at her wrists as she shoved her arms through. Mrs. Grant handed over a small bag with a thermos of soup, in case the power goes out, and Michael nodded his thanks. The walk home was into the wind. Sophie held his hand tighter than usual. They didn't speak. Their breath came out in visible clouds, carried away almost before it formed. Back inside, he moved through the house in deliberate circuits, checking windows, pulling curtains, setting the kettle on the stove. Sophie trailed after him, not asking questions, just matching her pace to his. When he lit the old oil lamp for the first time in months, she watched the flame bloom inside the glass with wide, unblinking eyes. The first flakes began as they sat down to dinner. They were small, almost invisible against the fading light, but they multiplied quickly. By the time he set the dishes in the sink, the yard was already wearing a thin white layer, the fence posts capped in sugar. Later, Sophie curled on the couch with the quilt, the teddy bear tucked under her arm. Michael stood at the front window, the lamplight at his back, watching the snow drift in wide, slow arcs. It muffled the street, softened the outlines of the houses across the way. He could feel the storm drawing closer, not in any sudden gust, but in the steady deepening of the quiet. He checked on Sophie before heading upstairs. She was half asleep, the quilt rising and falling with her breathing. The bear's small stitched smile rested against her cheek. Michael left the lamp burning low and stepped into the hall, listening for the wind. In that moment, standing there with the snow pressing against the windows, he felt this strange doubleness of it. The same readiness that had kept him alive in other places, now protecting something smaller, warmer. The danger was different, but the instinct was the same. And though the storm would come, as storms always did, he knew the house could hold against it. More importantly, he knew they could hold against it together. The storm settled in without hurry. The way some people enter a room, quiet at first, then filling every space until you realize they've been there all along. By nightfall, the wind had thickened into something more insistent, rattling the loose tin on the shed roof and sighing through the seam at the back door. Snowflakes hurled themselves sideways, sticking to the windows in uneven patches. Michael kept the oil lamp burning low in the living room, its light pooling over the quilt where Sophie sat curled up. The kettle on the stove let out a faint hiss, steam winding up into the dim air. Outside, the street lamp across the way glowed in a small halo, the falling snow turning it into a pale sphere. It was just past 9 when Sophie stirred. She'd been quiet most of the evening, drawing shapes that seemed to repeat themselves, circles nested inside circles, as if she were trying to find the right size for something. Michael looked up from the workbench in the corner, where he'd been sanding a piece of trim, and noticed her hand pause mid-crayon stroke. Her voice, when it came, was small and rough. "That my head hurts." Michael set down the sandpaper and crossed her. Her forehead was warm, not searing, but enough to quicken his pulse. She tried to wave it off, her eyes heavy-lidded, but the cough that followed was deep, catching her chest. The pharmacy was closed. The town clinic, too. He thought about calling Tom, but the lines had been unreliable since the wind picked up. Mrs. Grant might have something in her pantry, but she was on the far end of town. He checked the medicine drawer anyway, empty of anything stronger than cough drops. Sophie's breathing had a tightness to it he didn't like. He made the decision without speaking it out loud. They'd ride to the urgent care in the next town. In the garage, the truck sat under a dusting of snow that had blown in through the cracked siding. He tried the ignition. The engine turned over once, then died. Again, nothing. The fuel line was probably frozen. He didn't have time to fight with it. The old bicycle leaned against the far wall, its tires still holding air from autumn. He wheeled it out, brushing snow from the seat. Sophie was too weak to pedal, so he pulled the army coat from the hook and wrapped it around her, then added the quilt for good measure. She looked up at him without protest as he lifted her onto the crossbar, her arms looping around his middle. The first push into the street was against the wind. Snow stung his face, settling into his beard and lashes. The tires crunched over fresh powder, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the storm. Each breath burned his throat, but he kept his pace steady. Not a sprint, not in this cold, but strong enough to eat the distance. Street after street slid past, the houses huddled in on themselves, windows glowing faintly like lanterns. In the blur of motion, Michael caught glimpses of life inside. A man stoking a fire, a woman folding laundry, a dog curled on a rug. Warmth on the other side of glass. He pushed harder. On the outskirts of town, the road opened up into fields. Snow lay in shifting drifts here, the wind sweeping it sideways in low white waves. Sophie's head rested against his back, and he could feel the slow weight of her breathing through the coat. He called her name once, just to make sure, and felt her arms tighten slightly in response. A pair of headlights appeared behind them, hazy through the snow. A car slowed, moved to pass, then hesitated. Michael recognized the silhouette when the window rolled down. It was Tom. Without a word, Tom jerked his head toward the empty passenger seat. But Michael shook his head. The bike had already carried them this far, and in some stubborn, quiet way, he needed it to carry them the rest. Tom gave a short nod and drove on, his taillights bleeding into the storm until they were gone. The urgent care sign was a dull red rectangle in the distance. Michael coasted to the entrance, legs trembling, his hands stiff on the handlebars. Inside, the heat hit them in a wave, thawing the edges of his vision. A nurse with tired eyes took Sophie from him, her small figure disappearing down a hallway lined with pale blue curtains. Michael stood in the waiting room, coat unzipped, the quilt hanging heavy from his shoulders. He could still feel the shape of the ride in his muscles, the lean into the wind, the grip of cold air in his chest, the quiet weight of Sophie against him. Out the glass doors, the snow still fell, erasing the path they'd just made. Some things, he thought, were meant to vanish as soon as they were done. The important part was that they had gotten here. The storm broke sometime after dawn, but the quiet it left behind was heavier than the wind had been. Snow lay in smooth, untouched folds over the street, softening every hard edge. The plows hadn't come yet, and the only tracks were the faint curves Michael had carved the night before on the bicycle. When he stepped out of the urgent care that morning, the air was sharp and clean. Sophie was still inside, resting under a thin blanket, her fever lowered after a night of medicine and watchful nurses. She'd fallen asleep, clutching the same crumpled drawing she'd brought in her pocket. 2 circles, one inside the other. Michael didn't go home right away. Instead, he stood by the bike leaning against the building and looked at the road they'd traveled. It felt smaller now, as if the night had stretched it in his memory. The first person he saw was Clara Doyle. She was crouched in the parking lot, her gloved hands adjusting the lens on her camera. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him through the glass. Michael was about to turn away when she lowered the camera and walked over. "They should see this," she said simply, gesturing to the bike, to the path it had taken through the snow. She didn't wait for his answer before she stepped back and clicked the shutter again. By the time he wheeled the bike home, the plows had cleared one lane. A few neighbors were out with shovels, scraping their sidewalks. He noticed the way they paused when he passed, not out of curiosity, but in the kind of silent acknowledgement that comes when people know you've done something that matters. That afternoon, Tom Bennett showed up at the house, his cheeks raw from the cold. He carried a paper bag with 2 thermoses and a loaf of bread. He didn't make a speech about the ride or the storm. He just set the bag on the counter and started slicing the bread. Word traveled fast in a place like this. By the next day, Michael found a stack of firewood neatly arranged by the porch. Then came the grocery deliveries, bags left by the door with soup cans, tea, fresh fruit. Mrs. Grant brought over a jar of honey to keep her throat easy and stayed just long enough to pat Sophie's hair before heading back out into the snow. It wasn't charity in the way Michael had known it elsewhere, with its unspoken tally and quiet debts. Here it was something shared, like a hand resting briefly on your shoulder, reminding you weren't carrying the weight alone. Clara's photographs from that morning began to circulate online, paired with a picture she'd taken weeks earlier of Sophie in the quilt. This time, the caption was longer. A father rode through the worst night of winter to get his daughter to safety. Some roads aren't measured in miles. The comments came again, but Michael read even fewer of them now. It was enough to see the change in the people around him, the way strangers in the market would nod once in greeting, or how the postman lingered an extra moment when handing over the mail. At night, when Sophie was asleep and the house was still, Michael would stand on the porch and watch the street. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves in slow, steady beats. In the distance, the sound of a shovel against concrete echoed between houses. The storm had passed, but something had shifted in its wake. The air felt clearer, the town a little smaller. And the distance between him and the people who lived here, once measured in years away and empty space, was now bridged by something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't victory, and it wasn't relief. It was closer to belonging, though not the kind you set out to earn. It had come quietly, carried on the breath of the storm, and settled in the same way the snow had, softly, without asking permission. And for the first time since he'd come home, Michael thought maybe the house they lived in wasn't just a place to stay. Maybe it was a place to be known. The snow lingered for days, crusting over at night and softening again in the pale warmth of afternoon. Michael kept a narrow path shoveled from the porch to the gate, the rest of the yard left under its white cover, as if the storm had decided to press pause on everything it touched. Inside the house, there was no rush to resume the usual noise of living. Sophie still coughed at night, though less sharply now. She spent most mornings at the kitchen table with crayons and the kind of focus that made her small shoulders slope forward, her hair falling into her eyes. The circles she used to draw had shifted into houses, each with a roof pitched just so, windows glowing in yellow. Michael took those drawings and tacked them to the wall above his workbench. Not for decoration, but because they felt like plans, not the measured kind with blueprints, but the kind you carried in your chest. When the weather held above freezing for a day, he decided to start on the porch. The boards were warped from years of wet and sun, their paint chipped into patterns that looked almost intentional if you didn't know the truth. He fetched the toolbox from the shed and began pulling nails, each one giving with a tired squeal. He worked slowly, not because he had to, but because it seemed wrong to rush through something that had been waiting this long. The rhythm of it, pull, pry, lift, was its own kind of quiet company. Sophie came out once with 2 mugs of tea, both sloshing as she carried them. She sat on the top step and watched without asking what he was doing. "Cold out here," she murmured finally, her voice still a little hoarse. He just nodded, and they sat like that, the steam from their mugs curling up and away. By late afternoon, the light had begun its slow fade. Michael swept the porch free of splinters and bent nails, then covered the bare patches with a tarp. The work wasn't done, not even close, but there was satisfaction in seeing the worst of the rot stripped away. Over the next week, the repairs extended inside. A loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, the rattle in the front door's latch, the faucet in the bathroom that had to be coaxed into shutting fully. None of it was urgent, yet every fix felt like reclaiming something that had been quietly slipping away. Neighbors noticed in small ways. Tom Bennett stopped by with a bundle of cedar boards from his workshop. Mrs. Grant dropped off a tin of nails she said she'd found in the back of the pantry. Don't ask me why. Clara came once with her camera, snapping a picture of the porch half-painted, Sophie in the doorway holding a paintbrush like it was a flag. Michael didn't mind the interruptions. Each one was a reminder that the repairs weren't just about the wood or the paint. They were a way of saying we're still here, without having to say it. One evening, as he sanded the railing smooth, Sophie came out in her slippers, holding one of her drawings. This one was different. The house was theirs, but there were 2 figures on the porch, a little girl and a man. Above them, in uneven letters, she'd written home. He took it from her, without a word, his hand covering the spot where her crayon had pressed hardest. The sun was setting behind her, laying a band of gold across the yard, and for a moment, the cold didn't matter. Later that night, he taped the drawing to the inside of the front door. Every time he passed, he let his fingers brush the paper. It was still thin, still could tear if handled wrong. But it was also something built, and building was what they had left to do. It was one of those March mornings that didn't quite belong to winter or spring. The snow had retreated into the shadows along the fence lines, while the sun sat low but bright, making every puddle shimmer like oil on water. Michael was on the porch, sanding the last section of railing, when he noticed the unfamiliar car slowing near the end of the street. It idled there a moment, engine humming in a way that didn't fit the quiet of the neighborhood. Then, slowly, it rolled forward, stopping just short of his gate. The driver's door opened. Anna stepped out. She was dressed better than most in town, a tailored coat, boots with clean lines, a scarf that caught the light. Her hair was longer than he remembered, but the way she carried herself was the same, deliberate, as if every step had been considered before it touched the ground. Michael didn't speak. He kept one hand on the railing, the sandpaper loose in his palm. She paused by the gate, glancing once at the porch, then at the windows of the house. Her eyes softened when they found Sophie's drawings taped to the glass, but only for a flicker. "I heard she was sick," Anna said finally, her voice even. "I wanted to see her." Michael didn't answer right away. Inside, Sophie's laughter, light and unguarded, carried from the kitchen, where she was likely perched on the counter, helping Mrs. Grant shell peas. "She's fine now," he said. The words were simple, but the space between them held more than he cared to explain. Anna shifted her weight, the gravel under her boots crunching. "I wasn't here when—" She stopped, drawing in a breath. "I should have been here." Michael looked past her, down the road she'd driven. Beyond the curve, the highway stretched toward other towns, other lives. He wondered how many turns she'd taken to find her way back here, and how many she'd taken to leave in the first place. "Why now?" he asked quietly. Anna's gaze dropped to the ground, then lifted again, steady but not hard. "Because I thought I had time. And then I saw the picture, the one of you on the porch, and I realized time isn't what I thought it was." Clara's photograph. It had reached farther than he'd imagined, drawing eyes from places where their names meant nothing. Michael set the sandpaper on the railing, brushing the dust from his hands. "She's at the kitchen table," he said. "But you don't come in unless she wants you to." Anna nodded once. It wasn't agreement so much as acknowledgement. When Sophie appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, her hair in loose braids, she froze at the sight of the woman by the gate. Michael watched her expression shift, curiosity, recognition, then something quieter. Anna smiled, tentative. Sophia. The girl's eyes flicked to Michael. He didn't say anything, just met her gaze. After a moment, she stepped forward, her slippers making no sound on the porch boards. They stopped a few feet apart. Anna didn't reach out. She kept her hands in her coat pockets. "I just wanted to see you," she said softly. Sophie nodded, but didn't move closer. She glanced once toward the house, then back at her mother. "I'm helping with dinner," she said. And with that, she turned and went inside. Anna stayed by the gate a while longer, watching the doorway as if expecting it to open again. Michael remained on the porch, neither inviting her in nor sending her away. When she finally returned to the car, she looked over her shoulder once. Her mouth moved like she might say something, but the wind caught the words before they reached him. Then the car door closed, and the engine carried her away. Michael picked up the sandpaper again, the grit rough against his palm. Inside, Sophie's voice rose in some half-sung tune, and he let the sound settle over the moment, like a blanket pulled up against a draft. Some doors, he thought, could be knocked on again, but whether they opened, that was another thing entirely. The county courthouse sat 1 block off Main, a brick square that looked as if it had been set down too heavily and forgotten. March light lay thin across its steps, showing the salt lines from a winter that hadn't quite let go. Inside, the air carried the starch of old paper and floor polish. A hallway clock ticked with exaggerated patience. Michael arrived early. Habit mostly. He wore a clean white shirt, sleeves buttoned, the same dark pants he saved for church funerals and school meetings. In a manila folder under his arm were things that did not belong to courts. Sophie's drawings, a school note about counting by fives. The photograph Clara had printed and left in their mailbox with a handwritten "for you," not for anyone else. He didn't intend to show any of it. It just felt wrong to come empty-handed. Anna came later, walking beside a woman with a leather briefcase. Her hair was pulled back, a simple coat, the heels quieter than he remembered. She paused at the security table to sign her name, fingers stiff with nerves, then moved down the hall without looking left or right. When she saw him on the bench outside the courtroom, her gaze faltered and slid away, not out of contempt, but out of kind of carefulness, as if any direct look might crack whatever resolve she had gathered. The courtroom was smaller than television made such rooms seem. 4 rows of benches, a flag that had dulled to a sober red, a crest on the wall worn by time and heat. The judge entered as though stepping into a conversation already underway, hand brief on the rail. Chin tipped down to read. The clerk's voice was steady in its recital of names. There were few people to watch. A man in a brown hat who had wandered in to escape the wind. An elderly woman from church, her hands folded over a thrifted purse. Clara slipped into the last row with a notebook and no camera, her pen quiet, her breath slower than usual. The hearing moved in a straight line. Anna's lawyer spoke about intentions and stability, about changed circumstances and structure visits. Her sentences fit neatly, each one finding the next like joints in good woodwork. Anna sat very still while her life was lifted and turned in the light. Every now and then, she nodded at a word that seemed to land true. When it was his turn, Michael stood and kept his hands clasped so his sleeves wouldn't ride up. He cleared his throat once, not to stall, but to find a register that did not tremble. He did not talk about the storm or the ride through it. He did not mention the weeks of coughs layered over nights of counting breaths. He did not say "I was there." The room could infer it. "I want what keeps her steady," he said, only that. The simple kind of sentence a child might trust. He did not look at Anna when he said it. He looked at the judge because that is where sentences go in rooms like this. The judge asked a few questions, practical as fence posts, school, bedtime, who picked her up on Fridays. Michael answered without embroidery. Someone coughed in the back row. The sound traveled up the varnished benches and lost itself in the rafters. When Anna was asked to speak, she rose as if carrying a full glass. She described the ache of absence without pleading it. She did not assign blame. She spoke of postcards written and never sent, of standing across the street and watching a small figure walk hand in hand with a man in a white shirt. Her hands remained at her sides. She did not reach for anything. There was a moment, the room felt it, when all the parts balanced, the wish and the warning, the pull and the protection. It hovered above the tables like a breath held too long. Then the judge lowered his eyes to the papers and began to read. The language was tidy, unadorned. The law had its own grammar for these things, cool in the mouth. Request denied. Not unkindly. Not forever, but for now. In the interest of a child's stability. Review possible at a later date, with evidence of continuity and no disruption to the routine that had saved her sleep. The words did not fall like a gavel. They arrived like weather, inevitable, previously forecast. Anna's shoulders dipped the smallest degree, as if a strap had slid off and she did not bother to lift it. She nodded once, whispered thank you to no one in particular, and sat. Her lawyer touched her elbow the way you touch a doorknob you don't intend to turn. Michael exhaled through his nose, the kind of breath you let out when a doctor says it isn't pneumonia. Only a cold you must carry. He did not smile. He did not look victorious. He closed the manila folder without having opened it and rested both hands on the wooden rail as if it were the top of a fence he had repaired himself. The clerk spoke another case. People shuffled. The door sighed. Winter came in around ankles. In the hallway, the light was flatter, the echo longer. Anna stood by the bulletin board, reading nothing. For a heartbeat, he thought she might speak to him. Some small sentence to mark the place where two roads had crossed again. Instead, she pressed her lips together and nodded. A motion so slight it would not have rippled water. He returned the nod. Not agreement, not forgiveness, just the acknowledgement two farmers might offer across a field at first light. Then he stepped past, careful not to brush her sleeve. Outside, the air had a clean bite. A thin wind pushed a scrap of last week's newspaper along the steps until it caught in the iron rail. He paused at the bottom, feeling the weight of the folder under his arm, the absence of any need to open it now. Across the street, a school bus sighed to a stop. Children lifted their backpacks like small parachutes. He walked toward the truck, then remembered the ride he'd taken through the storm and changed course on instinct. Feet falling into the modest rhythm of someone moving under his own power. The courthouse behind him dwindled to a box of brick and windows. On the sidewalk near the square, Clara caught up, but did not take his pace. She matched it. No recorder, no pen now. They walked a block together without speaking. At the corner, she touched the brim of an imaginary cap and turned away, leaving him with the quiet satisfaction of a road that asked nothing except to be walked. When he reached home, the porch smelled faintly of sawdust and sun. Sophie's drawing, Home, was still taped on the inside of the door, its corners curled slightly. He pressed his fingertips to the paper as he passed, the way a man might test a healed bone. Upstairs, a window leaked a line of light across the hallway floor, bright as a blade. He stood in a moment, letting the warmth touch his socked feet, hearing the far-off clatter of a pot in the kitchen where Mrs. Grant had likely left something covered for later. It was not triumph. It was not even relief. It was steadiness, the narrow, necessary kind that holds when a child sleeps in the next room and the day has given you only what you can carry. He set the folder in the drawer with the spare batteries, closed it gently, and told the house, in the way a man tells a field by walking its fence, that for now, for tonight, they were still held. The light in the hallway thinned as a cloud went over. Then it brightened again. Not much, just enough to make the dust lift and drift like slow snow toward the places it always lands. The city received her as it receives weather, without opinion, without memory. Glass towers held a pale sky the color of dishwater. Buses sighed at corners. Steam lifted from a grating and disappeared into the afternoon. Anna carried her coat folded over one arm though the air was cold. The courthouse scent, paper and polish, still clung to the lining. She kept one hand on the strap of her bag, as if it might try to leave first. Her building's lobby smelled faintly of grapefruit cleaner and damp wool. A security guard glanced up, recognized her in the way people recognize a face from seeing it daily, not from knowing it. She took the elevator alone. The mirrored walls returned a careful woman to her, hair smoothed, lipstick exact, the small hesitation at the mouth concealed by practice. Floors flashed by like missed chances. Inside the apartment, the heat clicked on and off in short bursts. The rooms had the hell-breath quiet of a hotel after checkout. Everything in its place, nothing in use. She set the coat on the back of a chair and stood a moment without turning on the lights. From the kitchen window, cranes swung slow arcs above the river. On the counter, a bowl held 3 limes going soft under their own skin. The refrigerator hummed, opening on a shelf of polite items, sparkling water, a glass jar of capers, a half-used wedge of Parmesan wrapped in wax paper like something preserved from a better time. She ran water in the sink and held her hands under it until the cold bit her bones, then turned it hotter than necessary, watching steam thin into the air and vanish near the ceiling. The sound filled the room for a while. When she shut it off, the apartment seemed to echo. Mail waited on the dining table, a white fan of envelopes spread by the concierge's rubber band. She sat, tore them open one by one. A glossy invitation to a fundraising gala whose theme seemed embarrassed of itself. A credit statement that used the word minimum as if the word were merciful. A letter from a clinic reminding her of an annual exam she had rescheduled twice. The last envelope was gray, with her name printed in a font that tried not to look official. She didn't open it. In the bedroom closet, a row of dresses leaned into one another like tall women sharing a joke. She slid hangers along the rod, past the satin that had loved warm rooms and low lights, past wool that had known better winters than this one. On the highest shelf, a shoebox held paper snow like confetti from a parade she had not deserved, ticket stubs, a brochure from a hotel that overcharged for the view, a photograph taken at arm's length in late summer by a lake where the water looked heavier than air. She replaced the box carefully, making no sound. Evening came without flame. She heated water for tea and, forgetting the cup, drank from the pot lid. The television offered a selection of lives. Cooking shows in kitchens brighter than hospitals. Dramas where people raised their voices and were thanked for it. She turned it off. In the silence, a siren threaded distance into the room, then was gone. On the table, she spread a yellow legal pad and began writing sentences that would never be mailed. Not apologies. Those were quick and hot and left only smoke, but the cold work of inventory. I thought distance would choose for me. I mistook noise for safety. I believed a door would remain open simply because I wished it. The lines steadied her. She wrote until the pad made a small hill of pages on the right-hand side. When she looked up, it was after midnight. She slept badly, the kind of sleep that keeps a thumbnail on the seam of waking. At 4, she rose and walked the apartment in the dark, bare feet mapping a geography she had purchased and never fully occupied. The city below had thinned to trucks and taxis. Snow was promised by the news scrawl sliding along the bottom of a channel she didn't watch. She pressed her forehead to the glass and left a faint, oval print that faded as quickly as breath. At the office, the next day, the receptionist handed her a stack of briefs and a smile too careful. Meetings unspooled, slides advanced, water glasses were filled and emptied. She spoke when required, sentences like clean bones, and people nodded as if they had eaten. At lunch, a colleague asked about her weekend, and she answered with the kind of particulars that keep anyone from asking a second question. Movies, laundry, rest, the prayer of the unremarkable. The photograph appeared on 2 phones in the break room. A man in a white shirt outside a small courthouse, a child's drawing taped to a door in the background. The caption did not use names. It did not have to. Someone said, "It's everywhere today," and someone else said, "You know how these things go," and the microwave chimed like a desk bell in a quiet shop. By late afternoon, the gray envelope waited for her again on the dining table, as though it had grown legs and followed her home. She opened it. The paper inside was heavier than the others. An embossed letterhead looking pleased with itself. Notice of reassessment. The city wished to inform her of a change in value, which was a kind way of saying the mortgage would not any longer humor her. She folded the letter once, then again, until it fit under her palm like a stone. She walked to the window and watched the river collect the city's light and return it in pieces. A barge moved upriver with the patience of a large animal, shouldering the current. On the far bank, a billboard sold a life the length of a smile. 2 figures on a porch in a light that never came from the sun. She didn't look away, but she did stop seeing it. The phone buzzed with a message from a number she had once assigned a name and then deleted. The first words were simple, and for that, almost kind. "You all right?" She let the message sit as if it were a cup of something too hot to drink. Her thumb hovered. In the end, she turned the phone face down and covered it with the gray letter as if one could balance the other. She made soup from what she had, onion, the last carrot, a handful of rice that boiled into softness. She ate standing, bowl in one hand, spoon in the other, as if dinner were a pause between tasks. The steam fogged her glasses. She removed them and set them on the counter so the world could blur into something tolerable. A neighbor laughed in the hallway. The bright kind of laugh that believes itself. Doors closed somewhere, a dog shook its tags and settled. The building exhaled. She rinsed the bowl, turned the cup upside down to dry, and wiped a clean circle on the counter with the heel of her hand, an act that felt like drawing a boundary around a small piece of order. Near midnight, She opened the closet again and took down the shoebox. She removed the photograph from the lake and held it at arm's length, as if a little distance could turn it into a postcard from someone else's trip. Then she slid it back and added the courthouse notice to the stack of papers that were not memories but had memorized her. In bed, the ceiling offered its slow parade of small imperfections: hairline cracks, a paint bubble, a shadow where the lamp's chain hung. She followed them the way a traveler traces rivers on a paper map he cannot afford to fold. Sleep came like weather again. First a rumor, then a thin rain. Some mornings in this city gift a person a sense of being carried by the stream. This one did not. It asked her to lift her own weight and to carry, too, what could no longer be lifted. She dressed in the quiet, slipped her feet into shoes that had learned the exact shape of her steps, and left the apartment as she had entered it, unannounced, unclaimed. Down on the sidewalk, a delivery truck idled, breath pluming from its exhaust. A cyclist threaded between taxis with the grace of a fish. The river kept shouldering the distance. The city would not remember her, but it would hold her the way a harbor holds any vessel willing to take on water and still keep moving. She turned her collar up against the cold and walked toward a day that had not decided about her. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click of something that knew its business. In the glass, she was briefly two people, one going, one already gone. Then the reflection shook loose and let her pass. The motel was the kind of city barely notices, wedged between a pawn shop and a diner that smelled of frying oil even before dawn. Its sign flickered out every third letter, offering OELROMS to the few who bothered to look up. Anna stood in front of it with her bag, the kind you carry when you've stopped pretending you might return something to a closet. Inside, the hallway smelled of cigarette smoke that had long ago seeped into the drywall, becoming part of it. The carpet was a shade between maroon and rust, patterned with shapes that might have once been flowers. The clerk slid her a key card without asking for anything but cash. She slid him the bills without meeting his eyes. The room had no view. Only a wall 3 feet from its single window. In the space between, pigeons gathered on a ledge, shifting from one foot to the other, feathers puffed against the wind. She set her bag down on the dresser and sat on the bed. The mattress dipped toward the middle, as if it had been listening too long to other people's weight. There was a table against the far wall, square and scarred, with a plastic chair that flexed when she sat in it. She laid out what she had: the gray envelope from the city, the yellow pad with its unfinished sentences, the envelope of photographs she hadn't mailed, and 3 crumpled bills left from the rent she could no longer pay. She made tea in the small coffee pot, filling it with tap water that tasted faintly of metal. The steam fogged the mirror above the dresser, blurring her reflection into something both softer and more unrecognizable. She cupped her hands around the mug, holding it longer than necessary, just for the heat. The days in that room folded into one another like laundry left too long in a basket. Morning arrived as a pale smear of light along the wall, followed by the shuffle of feet in the hallway, the clink of ice from the machine near the stairs. She would walk to the diner for breakfast: 2 eggs, toast, coffee that came in a chipped mug, and then return to sit at the table, writing until the pad's pages curled under her wrist. Her writing was not confession, not apology. It was record-keeping of a different kind. The scent of Sophie's hair after a bath, the exact sound of Michael closing the porch door. The way the screen gave a small sigh. She wrote about the creek in the hallway of their old house, how it always betrayed you no matter how careful your step. She wrote about the shade under the maple tree in August, the circle of dirt where grass refused to grow. Once, mid-morning, she heard the faint rise and fall of a child's laughter from somewhere outside. It caught her off guard, thin and bright, like a ribbon caught in the wind. She stood, half-turned toward the window, but by the time she reached it the sound was gone, leaving only the pigeons shifting in place. Evenings she spent walking, not toward anywhere, just into the streets where neon signs trembled in puddles and strangers' faces passed without recognition. She stopped once at the pawn shop to look at the guitars in the window, their strings dusty but still catching the light. She remembered Michael playing once, years back, before they had the baby, before his hands belonged to wrenches and tools. The room became its own geography, the dip in the mattress where she slept curled on her side, the narrow strip of carpet she paced between table and door, the square of light that moved along the wall in the afternoon and disappeared by 6. She marked days not by the date, but by small events: a pigeon missing from the ledge, the the sudden silence of the ice machine, a new face at the diner counter. On the seventh night, a storm rolled in from the river. Rain struck the wall outside like handfuls of gravel. The gutter overflowed, sending a thin waterfall past her window. She lay on the bed, listening to it, her mind tracing the sound back to the house she'd left. The roof Michael had patched himself, the way water used to run down the back steps and pool near the lilac bushes. She could see it as clearly as if she were there, only she wasn't, and the thought settled heavy in her chest. Her money ran thinner each day. The crumpled bills on the table grew fewer. Replaced by coins, she counted in the mornings before heading to the diner. She ordered coffee only, nursing it for an hour while she wrote in the pad. The waitress didn't ask questions. She just kept the cup full and left the check face down. One afternoon, a news segment played on the diner's small television. The sound was low, but she didn't need it to know the image. Michael in the yard, fixing a section of fence. Sophie nearby, wearing a sweater she recognized, holding nails in her palm. The banner at the bottom read "Local Veteran keeps family home through community effort." Anna watched without blinking, spoon paused halfway to her mouth. When the image faded, she set the spoon down and stared at her reflection in the window. The rain had stopped, leaving streaks down the glass. The street outside was washed clean, at least for now. She took her coat from the chair and left the diner without paying, leaving her last 2 coins under the lip of the cup. That evening, she walked farther than usual, past the stretch of closed shops, past the rail yard where rusted cars stood in silence. She stopped on a bridge where the river cut the city in two. The water was high, carrying branches and scraps of paper, moving with a force that made her grip the railing. In the dark water, the city lights fractured and ran, pieces drifting towards somewhere she couldn't see. Back in the room, she lay on her back, eyes open to the ceiling. The hum of the small refrigerator filled the silence. The pigeons had gone from the ledge, leaving only a scatter of feathers. She thought of Sophie again, not the photograph version, but the real child, warm and shifting in her sleep, breathing the air of a house that still stood. She turned onto her side, pulling the thin blanket over her shoulder. The room was neither warm nor cold, only still. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to hold the darkness steady. The way you might hold a door against a wind you can't quite name. Outside, the city forgot her, but the forgetting was almost a kind of mercy. The bus let her off 3 blocks from the old neighborhood. The ride had been quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of the doors. Anna kept her head turned toward the window, watching the streets unroll. Gas stations she didn't remember, a bakery that used to be a hardware store, trees taller than they had been when she last walked here. She hadn't meant to come. That was the lie she told herself each time she bought the ticket. But her feet knew the turn at the corner, the dip in the sidewalk where rainwater always collected, the faint slant of the hill leading down toward the row of houses with peeling paint and porches that leaned a little with age. The Carter place, Michael's place now, sat like it always had. 2 stories of weathered clapboard and a roof that seemed to breathe with the wind. The porch steps were still uneven, though someone had added a handrail. From across the street, Anna could see the yard was neater than she'd ever known it. Grass trimmed, flower beds turned over for winter. A rake leaned against the siding, as if someone had stepped inside for just a minute. She stayed in the shadow of a bare maple, its branches writing thin lines against the sky. The cold traveled easily through her coat. She kept her hands deep in her pockets, fingers working the seam of the fabric. The curtains in the living room window were drawn halfway, enough for her to catch glimpses when a light shifted inside. Sophie appeared first, moving from one side of the room to the other, a blur of blue sweater and ponytail. She carried something in her hands, a piece of paper, maybe, or a book, and disappeared toward the kitchen. Michael followed, taller, broader than she remembered, a man who had been weathered into his shape. He carried a mug, steam lifting from it. Even from here, she could see the way he leaned slightly when listening, the same tilt he had used years ago when Sophie spoke about things that mattered to her and to no one else. Anna took a step closer to the curb, just enough that her boots scuffed the frozen leaves piled along the gutter. She told herself it was curiosity, not longing, but the truth pressed in all the same. She watched Michael set the mug down, then bend to pick up something Sophie had dropped. His lips moved. Sophie laughed, head tipping back the way children do when they trust the moment will hold. The sound didn't reach Anna, but she felt it anyway, a vibration in the chest. It was a sound she remembered from before the leaving, before the nights when silence in the house had been louder than any argument. A car slowed behind her, tires crunching the gravel at the edge of the road. She stepped back, letting it pass. And in the brief beam of its headlights, she caught her reflection in the Carter's front window, thin, ghost-like, standing in a place she no longer belonged. From the porch, Mrs. Grant appeared, wrapped in a thick cardigan. She carried a basket, laundry, perhaps, or a stack of folded linens, and sat on the railing before knocking on the door. Michael opened it, his smile easy, unguarded. The two spoke briefly, Mrs. Grant gesturing toward the basket, Michael nodding. Sophie appeared again, taking something from the top and holding it to her face, maybe smelling the fresh wash. Anna felt the heat rise in her throat, not from anger but from the sharp, clean ache of being outside something that was warm. She turned away before the door closed, her boots whispering against the pavement as she walked toward the corner. She didn't go far, just to the intersection where the streetlight hummed, its glow pooling on the asphalt. From there, she could still see the house if she turned her head, but she kept her eyes forward. Cars passed, their windows lit briefly with the glow of dashboards, the flicker of a phone screen. In the pocket of her coat, she felt the folded paper she'd been carrying for weeks. The envelope was soft at the edges, the writing on the front slightly smudged. Inside, the words were plain, written in her careful hand. I hope you're well. I hope she's well. I'm sorry for everything I took, and for everything I couldn't give back. She had imagined leaving it in the mailbox, sliding it under the door, handing it directly to Michael. But now, standing here with the winter air tightening around her, the thought of it felt heavier than it had in the motel room where she'd written it. A movement caught her eye, Sophie again, at the window, pressing her forehead to the glass. For a moment, Anna thought the child might be looking directly at her. She lifted her hand slightly, then let it fall. Sophie turned away, called by some voice Anna couldn't hear. The door closed. The curtains drew tight. The house became just another house on a street lined with them, holding its light inside. Anna stayed a while longer, her breath rising in small clouds, her hands numb in her pockets. Then she crossed to the opposite sidewalk and began walking toward the bus stop. The timetable in her head told her she had 10 minutes to make the next one. At the stop, she sat on the metal bench, the cold pressing up through her coat. She held the envelope in both hands, feeling the thickness of it, the edges that had worn soft with being carried. When the bus arrived, she slipped it back in her pocket and boarded. Through the window, she watched the house recede, its porch light a small, steady point in the dark. It stayed in view until the street bent and the bus turned, and then it was gone, leaving only the outline of the maple branches against the sky. She pressed her forehead to the glass, the vibration of the bus traveling through her bones. Somewhere ahead was the motel room, the table with its unfinished pages, the pigeons waiting on the ledge. Behind her, the house sat with its two lives. One lived, one remembered, neither of them hers anymore. The bus rolled on, carrying her toward the part of the city that didn't ask questions, toward streets where she could walk without being known, toward nights that ended without ceremony. In her pocket, the letter stayed folded, its words still unsaid. And outside, the winter deepened, laying its quiet over everything. The motel room was colder that night, the radiator clicking as if it were thinking about working, but never quite deciding to. Anna left her coat on after she came in. The smell of the bus, diesel and damp wool, still clinging to the fabric. She set her bag down on the bed and, without turning on the light, crossed to the small table under the window. The envelope was still in her pocket. She drew it out and set it on the table, smoothing the creases with her palm. Her name wasn't on it, only Michael's, written in the same hand she'd used years ago to label Sophie's lunchbox, to scribble lists for the grocery store. That handwriting felt like a relic, as if it belonged to someone she had once known and lost. The pigeons were gone from the ledge, leaving the narrow space between buildings strangely bare. Beyond the wall, the night pressed in, thick with the smell of wet concrete. Somewhere down the block, a siren started, rose, and fell away. She waited for it to come back, but it didn't. Anna picked up the envelope, held it by its corners. She thought about the porch light at the house, the brief shadow of Sophie at the window, the way Michael's head had tilted when Mrs. Grant spoke to him. Those images felt close enough to touch, but reaching for them only made her hands close on air. She opened the drawer of the table. Inside were a notepad with half the pages torn out, a pen without a cap, and the motel's laminated room service menu, its corners curled. She slid the envelope inside and closed the drawer gently, as if it might wake something. For a long time, she sat there, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes on the drawer. She told herself she'd deliver it tomorrow, or maybe the day after. There was no rush, only the slow accumulation of days, each one like a sheet of paper stacked on top of the other, pressing down until the bottom was lost from view. In the morning, she woke before the sun. The light in the room was the thin, metallic kind that comes just before dawn. She pulled on her boots and went to the diner, her breath puffing in small clouds as she walked. The waitress gave her the same corner booth and poured her coffee without asking. Anna opened the notepad she carried in her bag and began to write. Not the letter, but something else. She wrote about the maple tree across from the house, the way its branches used to reach toward the porch like they were trying to touch it. She wrote about Sophie's shoes lined up by the door, the smallest pair always tipped on its side. She wrote about Michael's old work gloves, stiff with use, hanging on a nail in the shed. The words came slowly, like water, finding its way through a clogged pipe. She wasn't writing for anyone but herself, and that made it easier to keep going. She filled 3 pages before the coffee went cold. Back at the motel, she opened the drawer again. The envelope was there, lying exactly as she'd left it, its paper slightly bowed from the humidity in the room. She picked it up, weighing it in her hand. It was light, almost nothing, but it was also the heaviest thing in the room. She thought about Sophie again. Not the image she'd seen through the window, but the little girl who used to climb into her lap without asking, who once cried because she'd drop her ice cream and the pavement had swallowed a hole. She wondered if Sophie would read the letter now, or if it would be handed to her years later. Long after the words had cooled, Anna placed it back in the drawer. She closed it firmly this time, and with that small act she decided not to decide. Not today. The days kept folding over each other. She saw the house again the following week from the same spot across the street, her boots in the same patch of frozen leaves. Nothing had changed. Michael still moving with a deliberate steadiness. Sophie still quick and bright. But something had shifted in her. The sight no longer pulled her forward. It held her in place like a hand on her shoulder, saying this far, no farther. One evening, after the sun had gone down and the streets were washed in the dull orange of the lamps, Anna walked past the post office. She paused, looking at the row of blue mailboxes out front. The letter wasn't in her coat pocket. It was still in the drawer at the motel. She kept walking. The motel clerk stopped her in the hall that night, holding a small package. For you, he said, his voice flat with disinterest. She didn't ask who had sent it. Inside was a book. Nothing special, just a worn paperback and a single scrap of paper used as a bookmark. On it, in a hand she didn't recognize, were the words, "People can forgive what they understand." She put the book on the nightstand and the scrap of paper in the drawer, next to the letter. They sat there together, 2 things waiting for a reason to be moved. By the time March came, the pigeons had returned to the ledge, their feathers catching the morning light. Anna stood at the window, watching them settle and resettle, never quite still but never really leaving. She thought about the house, about Sophie's laugh and Michael's steady voice. She thought about the letter in the drawer, waiting like a seed under frost. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel the urge to pick it up or carry it with her. She left it where it was, in that quiet space, letting it rest until something in her, something she couldn't name, was ready to open it again. Outside, the day went on. People moved through the streets, carrying groceries, holding hands, standing at bus stops. Somewhere, far enough away that she couldn't hear it, life in the house across from the maple tree went on too. Anna sat at the table, pen in hand, the notepad open. She began to write, not about the past, but about the smallest details of the present. The hum of the refrigerator, the scrape of the chair against the floor, the rhythm of her own breathing. The letter could wait. For now, this was enough. Winter loosened its hold in small, almost invisible ways. The snow along the fence line thinned first, shrinking into grainy piles that left damp rings on the earth. Then came the smell of thawed soil, faint but certain, carried in on the late afternoon wind. On those days, Michael worked outside longer, his jacket unzipped, the sleeves of his flannel rolled up to his elbows. The house had taken him a year to bring back to something close to solid. It wasn't the same as before. The walls still leaned a little where the foundation had settled. And there were places where the new boards didn't quite match the old, but it no longer felt like a place trying to collapse in on itself. He had done most of it in pieces after work, with Sophie trailing along in the yard, her boots 2 sizes too big so they wouldn't wear through in a month. She carried the smaller tools in a canvas bag, and sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, she would sit on the porch steps and draw on scraps of cardboard with a stub of pencil. One evening in early spring, Michael found her crouched beside the white front door, tucking a sheet of paper between the frame and the siding. "What's that?" he asked. She stepped back, a little sheepish, and he saw a picture in crayon. A house with a roof as red as the apples they picked in the fall, 2 stick figures standing side by side in the yard. Above it, in letters that leaned like they were learning to stand, "Our home." The next weekend, they painted the door. Not the red from her drawing. It would have been too bright for the weathered clapboard, but a deep, steady blue. Sophie helped, holding the brush with both hands. Her tongue caught between her teeth, in concentration. By the time they finished, the sun had dropped low enough to light the porch in gold. They sat there with the paint cans closed and the brushes soaking in a bucket, drinking lemonade from mismatched mugs. Inside, the house smelled of sawdust and whatever misses. Grant had baked that morning. She'd stopped by with a plate of cornbread while Michael was fixing the loose stair rail. And Sophie had eaten 3 pieces before they even made it to the kitchen counter. The walls were still bare in places, but the shelves held a little more each month. Books from the library's discard sale, a clock from Tom's garage, a photograph of Michael and Sophie standing in front of the half-painted porch. Some nights, after Sophie was asleep, Michael would walk through the rooms without turning on the lights. The dark didn't bother him anymore. He could tell where the floorboards dipped, where the wind liked to find its way in, where Sophie's drawings were taped low on the hallway wall. The house had a rhythm now, slow, steady, like the tick of a clock you don't notice until you stop to listen. It wasn't lost on him that people still remembered the way it had been before, shuttered, peeling a yard gone to seed. He'd overheard it at the hardware store, in the quiet way someone said, "He's making it livable again," as if they hadn't expected it to be possible. He didn't bother to correct them. Livable was enough. On a Saturday morning in April, Sophie brought home a pot of marigolds from school. She sat on the porch rail and announced it was for good luck. By afternoon, she dug a small square of soil near the steps and planted them there, the yellow heads nodding in the breeze. Michael watched from the porch, sipping coffee, as she pressed the dirt down around the stems with careful hands. Later, while she napped on the couch with a book open on her chest, he walked out to the road and looked back at the house. It wasn't perfect, but it stood without sagging, its windows catching the light in a way that made them look cleaner than they were. The marigolds made a small, bright mark at the front, and behind them, the door stood open just enough for the smell of coffee and would smoke to drift out. Tom stopped by in the evening, his truck pulling up in a spray of gravel. He brought a box of old hinges and doorknobs, in case you need them, and stayed for a beer on the porch. They didn't talk much. Just watched the light fade until the marigolds were only shadows against the steps. When Sophie woke, she joined them, her hair rumpled from sleep. She curled into Michael's side, and he rested his hand lightly on her shoulder. The air had cooled enough to see their breath, and from somewhere down the block came the sound of a screen door closing. In the quiet, Michael thought about how far the house had come and how much further there still was to go. It wasn't just repairs, it was the way the space felt now. The way Sophie's laughter traveled down the hall, the way the kitchen lights spilled across the floor in the mornings. That night, before he turned in, he passed the front door and saw Sophie's crayon drawing still tucked in the siding. The paper was a little curled at the edges from the damp, but the colors hadn't faded. He left it there, thinking it belonged exactly where she'd put it, half hidden, but always part of the house. In bed, the sounds of the night settled around him. The creak of the roof, the faint rustle of wind through the marigolds, the soft breathing from Sophie's room. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like the house was something he had to rescue. It was holding its own now, and in a way, so was he. He closed his eyes, knowing tomorrow would bring more work, a loose shutter to fix, a fence post leaning after the thaw, but the thought didn't weigh on him. The future, for once, felt like something he could meet at the door. By late spring, the air had changed. The damp bite of winter was gone, replaced by a warmth that seemed to draw people back onto their porches, into their yards. Lawnmowers hummed in the distance. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent again. Michael stood on his own porch one evening, leaning against the railing. The boards felt smooth under his palm, sanded and painted not long ago, still faintly smelling of the oil-based coat he'd applied. Sophie was inside at the kitchen table, her pencil scratching lightly over paper. She'd taken to making lists lately. Things they needed for the garden, books she wanted from the library, games she thought they could play on rainy days. It had been months since Anna's shadow had appeared on the edges of their life. He hadn't seen her across the street or in town. The letter, if it still existed, had never reached his hands. There was an odd kind of peace in that absence, though he wouldn't have called it forgiveness. Forgiveness was something active, a choice you had to make. What he felt was more like the stillness after a storm. The way the air hangs heavy, not yet certain if the clouds are truly gone. Inside, Sophie laughed softly at something she'd drawn. He could see her through the window, her hair falling forward as she bent over the table. The sight pulled him in. He stepped inside, letting the door ease shut behind him. The kitchen was warm, smelling faintly of the bread Mrs. Grant had brought over that afternoon. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Look," she said, holding up her paper. 2 figures again, this time. They were in a garden, marigolds blooming at their feet, a fence standing straight behind them. Above it, she'd written us in careful, blocky letters. Michael smiled, a quiet curve of his mouth that stayed, even as he looked back at the drawing. "It's good," he said simply, and set it down on the counter. He poured them both glasses of milk, and they sat together at the table without speaking much more. Later, after she was asleep, he walked the house again, as he often did. The habit had started in those first restless months, checking locks, making sure the old wiring hadn't sparked, that Sophie's blankets were pulled up to her chin. Now it was less about worry and more about knowing, about being familiar with the creaks in the floor, the sighs in the walls, the way the wind moved through the eaves. In the front hall, he stopped at the door and touched the edge of Sophie's first drawing, the one that set our home. It had weathered the months just like the house had. Edges curled a little, but the lines still clear. He wondered if, years from now, Sophie would remember these nights the way he hoped she would. Not for the absence of what they'd lost, but for the presence of what they'd built together. Stepping out onto the porch again, the night air settled around him. The sky was clear, stars sharp enough to almost touch. Somewhere down the road, a screen door banged, followed by the low hum of voices. He stood there for a long while, letting the cool sink in, the sounds fade and return. It was then the question rose, the one that had lingered unspoken since the day Anna left. It wasn't about her, not exactly. It was about the nature of breaking and mending, of whether the two could ever meet without leaving a seam visible. If Anna came back, not for Sophie's sake, but for her own, would he open the door? Could he? And if he did, would that be forgiveness? Or just another kind of surrender? The thought didn't trouble him the way it once might have. It hung there, quiet, like a coat on a peg you might or might not take down someday. He looked at the house, at the glow of the kitchen window, where Sophie's pencils were still scattered across the table. He thought about how fragile it all was, and how at the same time, it felt unshakable. Michael leaned on the porch rail, feeling the wood solid under his hand. The marigolds in the small garden swayed in the faint breeze. Somewhere in the dark, a whippoorwill called. If there was an answer to the question, he didn't need it tonight. What mattered was here, the house standing firm, the child sleeping safe, the slow, steady rhythm of life moving forward. And yet, the question remained, not as a wound, but as a thread woven into the fabric of their days. If it were you, could you forgive?